During the 1980s, the crack epidemic hit the United States of America really hard. This caused the rise of some of the most ruthless kingpins the great land has ever seen. Men who took the game to another level because they realized the territory was up for the taking. These men realized that they could make a fortune from the sale of illegal substance. And they really went ahead and made millions, some even made billions, that were not proven. If it wasn't for law enforcement agents, most of these men would probably cause the downfall of many American states. Today, we will take a trip down memory lane into the stories of some of the most powerful substance kingpins in America's history. Number 5. Felix Mitchell. Felix Wayne Mitchell, also known as Felix the Cat, was a notorious drug kingpin operating in Oakland, California, who headed the criminal organization known as the 69 Mob. Born on August 23, 1954 in East Oakland, California, Mitchell began a life of crime early. While still a teen, he created a network of criminals and nicknamed them the 69 Mob. The crew expanded rapidly, creating a substance empire focused primarily on the sale of H that encompassed not only Oakland, but surrounding Bay Area's cities. His success did not go unnoticed. His network continued expanding and began including kingpins from Los Angeles and Detroit, Michigan. Mitchell's success, however, was not without difficulties. He faced opposition from Mickey Moore and his associated criminal family, in addition to the Funktown USA gang, led by Harvey Washington, over control of the East Bay H market. Nonetheless, his substance business was incredibly successful, and it was estimated Mitchell was earning anywhere between $2 million and $4 million per month. With his drug wealth, Felix Mitchell lived lavishly, throwing parties, buying expensive cars, and purchasing fancy clothing. Additionally, he shared his income with local youth and community programs. Consequently, Mitchell quickly became a local folk hero. In order to maintain control over their turf, the 69 Mob utilized many techniques that have now become the basis of the modern substance trade. These techniques included the use of youths as delivery agents and spotters, along with drive-by shootings to punish both their enemies and disobedient clients. By the 1980s, Mitchell's H empire had grown to epic proportions and was the continued target of many attacks. Conflict was unavoidable, and violence became part of their standard operations. Given his high profile, Mitchell, not surprisingly, became the target of local authorities. In 1985, Oakland police captured and arrested Mitchell. He was then tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. A year later, on August 21, 1986, at Leavenworth Penitentiary, a fellow inmate executed Mitchell. Mitchell died 2 days before his 32nd birthday. Felix Mitchell's funeral followed over a week later, August 29, 1986. The amount of money spent and the incredible number of onlookers garnered national attention. The funeral procession, which included 4 Rolls-Royces, multiple limousines, a horse-drawn carriage, and a $6,000 coffin, was viewed by an estimated 8,000 mourners along the route. Many law enforcement supporters used the event as proof of the significant impact substance were having on the country, and particularly on vulnerable, impoverished neighborhoods in cities like Oakland. Mitchell's incarceration and death did not lead to the destruction of the Big H industry. Rather, both the level and scope of crime and the volume of substance on the streets of Oakland and other East Bay communities increased heavily after his funeral. This became known as the Felix Mitchell paradox. Without Mitchell maintaining control over the market, it quickly spun out of control and resulted in even greater growth and more violence. Number 4. Demetrius Fenor. Demetrius Big Meech was born on June 21, 1968 in Detroit, Michigan. He began selling $50 bags of cocaine on the streets of Detroit during their high school years in the late 1980s. Hence, their original group was known as 50 Boys. By 2000, the Fenor brothers had established a large organization overseeing multi-kilogram coke distribution sales in numerous U.S. states, including Alabama, California, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, and Tennessee. A 2-year federal investigation of the Fenor organization estimated its nationwide membership at over 500. In a conversation with his brother caught by the DEA on wiretap, Terry discussed his worries that his brother Demetrius was bringing the wrong type of attention to their business with his excessive partying. By the time charges were filed against the Fenors, the government had 900 pages of typed transcripts of wiretapped conversations from Terry's phone in a 5-month period. In November 2007, the brothers pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise. In September 2008, both brothers were sentenced to 30 years in prison for running a nationwide coke trafficking ring, which lasted from 2000 to 2005. Demetrius Fenor is serving out his sentence at Federal Correctional Institution, Sheridan, and is scheduled for release on May 5, 2028, around his 60th birthday. Terry Fenor was released to home confinement on May 5, 2020, after being granted a compassionate release due to health ailments and an effort from the Federal Bureau of Prisons to release certain inmates in order to limit the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic within federal prisons. Demetrius Fenor also sought his release under the same guidelines. However, a federal judge rejected the move, claiming it would be premature to authorize his release as his prison record suggests. He has not changed and continues to promote himself as a kingpin, further stating his disciplinary record includes violations such as possession of a cell phone and weapons, as well as substance use. Testimony given during various trials indicated the Fenor organization stated that BMF operated 5 stash houses in the Atlanta area. Approximately every 10 days, vehicles would arrive with 100 to 150 kilograms of white powder packed in secret compartments. Workers at the stash houses were paid to unload the substance and store them. Customers who ordered would call in and say they had their vehicle ready, meaning a transportation vehicle to put the narcotics in. Depending on the size of their order, they were directed to a particular stash house where they would pull in, go inside, and hand over money in $5,000 bundles. The substance was usually sold at $20,000 per kilogram. The same vehicles would then be filled with cash to be sent back to the Mexican sources of supply. Workers inside the stash houses had certain duties, such as counting bulk amounts of cash, usually in the millions. Other people were packaging the coke for customers. BMF also received narcotics through large containers at the airport. Number 3. Ricky Ross. Ricky Donald Ross was born on January 26, 1960 in Texas. His family relocated to Los Angeles when he was 3 and settled in the South Central area. They lived near the 110 freeway, which helped inspire Ross's nickname. Growing up in poverty, Ross showed interest in making money from a young age. Though Ross had apparently come close to failing his classes many times because of his illiteracy, he later said that his high school coach ensured that he stayed enrolled in school. But Ross would ultimately drop out before graduation, and another type of education would soon begin. At some point in the late 1970s or early 1980s, Ross bought coke for the first time for $50, but the day after buying it, he decided to sell it for $100. While some people in his neighborhood were just starting to get hooked on the substance, he got hooked on making money from it. Essentially, Freeway Rick Ross fell into the crack trade almost overnight and knew that he was onto something huge. This was especially true when he met a Nicaraguan-born trafficker named Oscar Danilo Blandon. With Blandon came seemingly unlimited amounts of coke, and thus, seemingly unlimited cash for Ross when he started dealing with him. According to Ross, he was a millionaire by the age of 23, largely thanks to help from Blandon, who was not only his supplier, but also his mentor. But his newfound wealth was also undoubtedly helped by the 1980s crack epidemic, which wreaked havoc on Los Angeles and beyond. It was only a matter of time before Ross's business would expand to dozens of other cities in the United States, making him even wealthier. Ross invested most of his money in real estate across Southern California. Freeway. Rick Ross was first investigated by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department in 1985, but they struggled to pin anything on him. So 2 years later, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department teamed up with the Los Angeles Police Department to form the Freeway Ricky Task Force. In April 1987, some members of this task force attempted to set Ross up. Ross had apparently escaped a police foot chase one evening, so officers decided to plant a kilo of cocaine along the route that he had taken, but the charges were later dismissed due to police misconduct. Later in the 1980s, however, cocaine bound for Ross's territory in Cincinnati was linked to him. This time he couldn't avoid arrest, and he was indicted in cases not only in Cincinnati, but also in Los Angeles and Tyler, Texas. Prosecutors later estimated that between 1982 and 1989, Ross had resold 3 tons of white powder, with gross earnings of $900 million. He pleaded guilty to narcotics trafficking charges and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He began serving his prison sentence in 1990, but it was unexpectedly cut short due to the massive corruption in the sheriff's office that had pursued him so relentlessly. Ross was offered an opportunity to testify for the government in exchange for serving less time in prison, and he agreed. Because of this, he was freed less than 5 years into his original sentence. However, Freeway Rick Ross wouldn't be free for long. He'd soon be ensnared by his former supplier Blandon, who, unbeknownst to Ross, had become a paid federal informant after narrowly avoiding a life sentence. Blandon claimed to Ross that the Colombians were on his back and that he desperately needed money, so Ross agreed to help him out. Then, on March 2, 1995, in a parking lot near San Diego, Ross was busted during the deal by the DEA. He was later found guilty of conspiring to sell white powder that had been provided by the DEA. This was considered his 3rd felony conviction, so this time around, he was sentenced to life in prison. Not long after he began his life sentence, Ross received a visitor, investigative journalist Gary Webb. It was only then that Ross learned about Blandon's link to the Contras, a group of rebels who had been trying to overthrow the socialist government of Nicaragua in the 1980s. As Webb told it, Blandon had been selling drugs to finance the Contras' weapons. Webb, who would later publish the expose Dark Alliance, alleged that the CIA was purposely funding the Contras, knowing full well that these rebels were using crack sales in Los Angeles to fund their attempted coup. Ross, who knew little about Blandon's past, was shocked to hear that he may have been a pawn all along. While reading, he discovered a technicality in his case that would allow him to spend less time in prison. His sentence was soon reduced to 20 years, and he ultimately ended up serving just 14. Ross was officially released in 2009, and he still walks free today. Since his release in 2009, Freeway Rick Ross has reinvented himself as an author, actor, prison reform activist, and legal cannabis entrepreneur. Number 2. Rael Edmund. Edmund was born on November 26, 1964, in Washington, D.C. His parents, Rael Edmund Jr. and Constance Bootsy Perry, were both government workers who moonlighted as substance dealers. Perry began teaching Edmund and his siblings how to deal narcotics and prescription drugs while they were all very young. Edmund was pulled into the trade at the age of 9. School proved to be easy for Edmund, and the young man flourished in the classroom. Edmund was on the fast track to college. His life at home, however, drew him further and further away from a promising future. By the age of 18, he had already dropped out of college to make easy money cutting coke for a local dealer. Around this time, Edmund met Cornell Jones, a D.C. kingpin. Through Jones and associate Tony Lewis, Edmund made key connections. Using his knowledge of his neighborhood, Edmund created what he called the Strip, a series of back-alley escape routes for dealers to escape police. He tapped local kids to act as lookouts and hired his family members to help him set up and run his coke ring. With the advent of crack, a smokable form of white powder, Edmund found himself with an instant market of desperate addicts. He began looking for ways to supply his ever-expanding customer base. He found it in April of 1987. While on a trip to Las Vegas, Edmund met with Melvin Butler, a Los Angeles dealer who could supply him with Colombian coke at low prices. What started out as one shipment turned into hundreds of kilos each month. Edmund was making millions by the time he was 22. By 1989, Edmund had a sizable share of the substance trade in D.C., nearly 60% of the city's market. He was also involved in a flurry of violence, with approximately 30 homicides tied to Edmund and his crew. Between 1985 and 1989, the city's homicide rate had doubled, much of which D.C. law enforcement tied to the substance trade, and coke-related hospital emergencies rose an estimated 400%. Police began waging a war on narcotics, and Edmund was their primary target. After a series of wiretaps, investigations into his finances, testimony from informants, and confessions from members of his narcotics ring, police had enough evidence to put Edmund behind bars. On April 15, 1989, Edmund was arrested along with 28 associates, 11 of whom were members of Edmund's family. Put on trial under unprecedented security, Edmund's case became a daily spectacle. Jailed at Quantico Marine Base, Edmund was flown to court each day by helicopter. The jurors were kept anonymous, held in separate homes, and placed behind bulletproof glass. More than 100 witnesses testified in the trial, which led to Edmund's conviction on multiple counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. Conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute more than 5 kilograms of cocaine. On September 17, 1990, Edmund was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Edmund's mother was sentenced to 24 years for participating in her son's ring, and Tony Lewis also received life without parole. He is out now in part because he cooperated with the government after the FBI learned Edmund was making large coke deals with a Colombian cartel from a federal prison in Pennsylvania. In 1994, he flipped and became an informant. For the next 20 years, Edmund provided information to the feds that led to the convictions of at least 200 people, court records show. Federal prosecutors have said Edmund helped jail dozens of other narcotics dealers, break up distribution rings, and even taught prison authorities how to better prevent trafficking inside the prison system. His assistance previously resulted in the early release of his mother, Constance Bootsy Perry, who was sentenced to 14 years for her part in her son's operation. It also prompted authorities to put Edmund under witness protection. Number 1. Frank Matthews. Frank Black Caesar. Matthews was called one of the biggest H and coke traffickers in United States history by the Drug Enforcement Agency. Born on February 13, 1944 in North Carolina, he became involved in several criminal incidents from a young age. Matthews was raised by his aunt due to the death of his mother when he was 4. Dropping out of school in 7th grade, he led a group of similarly aged children in stealing chickens in Durham. He was arrested on a charge of assault and served a year at the State Juvenile Reformatory in Raleigh. Upon release, Matthews moved to North Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There, he hustled numbers for an illegal lottery. After his arrest in 1963, he was forced to leave Philadelphia. Matthews continued hustling numbers, but now as a barber in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, New York. In 1965, 21-year-old Matthews decided to jump into the H trade. His connections made from his number hustling days provided an excellent platform for his transition into a new area of crime. At the time, in the mid-1960s, the primary suppliers of H in the United States were the Italian mafia crime families. Initially, Matthews sought to join them and thereby enter the market. However, Despite being able to gain an audience with both the Gambinos and Bananos, his application to join was rejected. Matthews now turned to Roland Gonzalez, a Cuban-American and one of the major drug dealers in Harlem. Roland Gonzalez arranged for Matthews to get H and coke directly from Caracas, Venezuela, and Marseille, France, which would then be distributed in the United States. Their partnership quickly propelled Matthews' illicit organization to the top of the New York substance business. Working with African-American and Latino underbosses, by the early 1970s, Matthews oversaw a network had expanded into 21 states from Massachusetts to Alabama and west to Missouri. Matthews spent his wealth lavishly. He purchased a mansion for his girlfriend, Barbara Hinton, and his 3 sons on Rottenwood Road in Staten Island, New York. In 1971, Matthews organized a conference of major traffickers who agreed to take control of the international shipment of H and coke to the United States, thus eliminating the mafia middlemen. Matthews's narcotics empire continued to expand until January 1973, when he was arrested at the Las Vegas airport on charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute H and coke. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Initially, his bail was set at $5 million as federal prosecutors felt he would flee. However, his bail was reduced to $325,000, and he was freed the same day. Shortly after, on June 26, 1973, Matthews disappeared with $20 million in cash. To this day, there have been no verified sightings as observers continue to debate whether he is dead or alive.